Okay, as Anne said, I think we're at almost critical mass. So let's get going. And if anybody joins us, we just have to welcome them as they pop in. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for taking your time for this webinar today. I know they got a lot of things going on, but we hope you'll find this really useful. And we were super excited when we heard that among our own America Amplified team, we had Scott Blanchard, who has been trained in this and has received training in this and has passion about creating a trauma-aware newsroom, which we, in putting this together, realize how important it is. Not only because of what we're going through, but because we will likely have to continue to do it in the future. So just a quick introductions. My name is Kathy Liu. For those who don't know me, I'm the digital and social media editor for America Amplified. Before this job, I spent about 15 years in newspapers, and I was last a features editor at the Kansas City Star and at the Roanoke Times before that. For me, this is a super important topic because I have been, I was at the Roanoke Times when the Virginia Tech shootings happened in 2007. And I just remember at the time going. Everybody was on full cylinders trying to cover the story. It was just incredible what was going on. And we were not a huge newsroom. And about a week and a half afterward, I remember our managing editor, making sure everybody was okay, but also just bringing in masseuses to the newsroom and offering, free massages to the staff to help us just relieve some of the stress that we were feeling and to recognize the traumatic experience that it was to have to be on this all the time and just never, we're story after story after story. So I found that in retrospect, it was nothing I thought about at the time in the middle of the moment that we needed. It was nothing that, because we were all just responding to the crisis as we do as journalists. And in retrospect, I thought it was a really nice step back for her to do and to provide. And it made me value her leadership and value the newsroom more because she had the wherewithal to think of that. And now I will I'll throw it to Scott Blanchard, who's the editor of StateImpact Pennsylvania and has had training for the DART Center. And he is part of our America Amplified network. Scott, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us and being interested in this. I came to it, just a brief origin story or whatever. I came to it mainly because we had a school shooting in York County where I worked in 2003 and dealt with the coverage of all of that. And then much later, 9 years later, actually, I was the editor on a project where we went back and tried to talk to people about the lasting trauma of that school shooting. It happened in a middle school. So at that point, we were talking to young adults and how it had affected their lives. And then secondarily, our newspaper, or our newsroom sent, as part of the organization that owned it, sent 7 people to Newtown in 2012 to help with group coverage of the shooting there. I did not go, but I was the direct editor for one of the people who did. And then a photographer and I in our newsroom gathered everyone together when they got back to talk about their experience, and what we heard in that conversation got us motivated to really address this issue and do the kind of, or attempt to do the kind of culture change that we'll talk about today in really addressing these issues. So that's me.
Thank you. A few housekeeping things, and then Scott will run the show. Please stay muted, but we would love for you to show your face if you'd like to. It'd be good to see faces and meet people virtually. And please ask questions as we go along. Either raise your hand to ask it over video or use the chat box. We're happy to have that discussion as we talk.
All right. So this actually, the idea for this webinar actually came up from our America Amplified editors call a week or so ago, where we were talking about news organizations and newsrooms covering the protests and some of the issues that we were being confronted with as journalists there. And we know, everybody knows, everyone who's in this business knows that there's a lot going on right now in terms of covering protests, being exposed, potentially exposed to coronavirus, and amid that, even if you're taking all the precautions that you can. And now we're seeing journalists arrested and assaulted with really frightening regularity at these protests when they're out there simply trying to do their job. The idea behind us talking about this now is that trauma awareness and peer support integrated into your newsroom with a real place at the table can really help journalists and newsrooms strengthen the skills and resilience that we all need, to cover these stories that we have a responsibility to do and a responsibility to do well for our communities. So that is that's sort of what we're doing here and what we'll talk about. And a lot of, and I'm going to give full credit off the top. A lot of my training was at the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma in New York in 2014, and I've maintained relationships with people at DART and connected with DART, and then built those out to have relationships with people in the trauma journalism field and with other journalists who regularly cover difficult stories and are exposed to a lot of nasty things. And so I give a lot of credit to the DART Center for what you'll hear. That's where my training comes from. And then, like I said, I've built connections and relationships, and then had experience both in newsrooms doing this work and also training other newsrooms to do it. So I love this quote from Bruce Shapiro, the executive director of DART, because he talks about, this isn't just something that stories of trauma and dealing with trauma and peer support is not just something that you're either good at or you're not. These are skills that we can develop as journalists. We can change our brains. We can learn more, and we can put those things into action. And the idea is, as he puts it here, to strengthen our capacity to cover traumatic events. So it's a combination of taking care of the people who are working on these difficult stories and taking care of ourselves, as well as, and marrying that with best practices of how to cover, how to effectively and responsibly cover stories involving trauma survivors or other very difficult situations. We've been talking over the last week, mainly Ann, Kathy, and I, about how important this is right now for some very specific reasons. And this tweet lays it out about as well as it could be laid out. And there's an excerpt from this piece that this tweet links to right here, where this columnist lays out what is happening and the special circumstances that are happening for journalists of color regarding covering protests that are about people of color, and inequality and systemic racism and police brutality, and the effect of COVID-19, which we know now is affecting people of color more severely than others. So it's like a perfect storm that's coming together. And so I think in our conversations with Ann and Kathy and I, this just underscores, why trauma awareness and peer support, I think, is important. 10 years ago, 5 years ago, a year ago, it's always important. It's never not important, but there are some special circumstances now that draw us to it and allow and open the door for a deeper conversation on some of these issues. So the bottom line is, I think that once we start to give trauma awareness and peer support a place at the table, like I said, we better equip ourselves, both as editors and staffers, to act on these issues and to act in our newsrooms and or in other newsrooms that we're associated with, to strengthen those newsrooms. And one of the core issues about being attentive to the effect that covering these kinds of stories can have on staffers is that it is a reason why journalists leave the business, or it can be. It definitely is the reason for some. And we're all invested in our people, and we want to keep the best people in our newsrooms, not just because they're good people in our newsrooms, but because journalism with a big J, the whole concept of journalism, needs the best and the brightest if we're going to do our jobs well and be part of this functioning civic discussion and this democracy and this experiment and all those grand things that we talk about. So we need good people in our newsrooms, and when we have good people in our newsrooms, we want to do everything we can to keep them. And part of my experience, I'll just pause for a second here and say, is that after following the training that I had, and after we began to work on these concepts in our newsroom in New York, I realized that several years earlier, we lost a good reporter and person because of issues related to trauma journalism. And at the time, I didn't know enough, and our newsroom didn't know enough, and we didn't have the culture that we needed to have to be able to get to that person and help that person work through these issues that were going on. We simply looked at it as a performance issue, and it was more than that, I'm convinced now. And years after we began this culture change and we really worked on these issues, we were able to keep a good journalist and a good person in our newsroom who was at risk of leaving the business because of issues related to trauma journalism. And we were able to recognize it. We were able to work with that person. We knew we had a much better understanding of how we could help somebody in that situation. And we felt like that was a victory, being able to keep a good journalist in the newsroom and a good person in our newsroom. So, excuse me, the idea behind our meeting today is that and this is what I would advocate for, is that newsrooms try to make trauma awareness and peer support part of how you do your work. Just like everybody's been through, I always say this, but everybody's been through, the age when you had to have a video with every story, or everyone's done metrics and is either on Chartbeat or Google Analytics or whatever, and everyone's had training on that. Well, and on a million other things. And I think this needs to be part of newsrooms culture in training and awareness and how we do our work. So briefly, trauma awareness focuses on the learning aspect of it, learning more about trauma and what it does to people, and how that can affect how we do our jobs when we cover survivors and others who experience trauma. Peer support is helping our colleagues, is learning some specific things we can do to be watchful and specific ways that we can help our colleagues when they are affected, if they are affected by a story they're covering or a story that's just happening in the newsroom. So again, to go back to Bruce, Bruce likes to make the point that and what he means by this comment is that most newsrooms, especially daily news organizations, cover crime in courts, and so it's sort of a constant churn of doing reports on the bad things that people do to one another, and we all cover natural disasters, and whether it's a tornado or a hurricane or whatever it is, everyone does that. Not everyone understands really what the deep effects of those situations are. It can be it's in the headlines for a couple of days and then you move on to the next story type of thing. And his point here is do the aftermath stories, do the stories that bring light to how a person or a community processes the trauma and what happens 5 years later or 10 years later, and how that becomes part of that person or that community's makeup and becomes part of who they are. And the more we can tell those deeper kinds of stories, the stronger our communities are going to be, because they're going to understand more about who lives there, what they're going through, and it's an important thing, I think. The key point here for this bullet point here is I think, and this also resonates, this is something that Kathy brought up, and Kathy, if you want to jump in, feel free, but we've seen some instances in the past couple of weeks where, and the ones that Kathy mentioned were at the New York Times with the pushback on the Tom Cotton editorial, and then the Philadelphia Inquirer staff, basically, as they put it, calling in sick and tired of just words and not action where it concerned issues of diversity and inclusion in their newsroom. And they were touched off by a tone-deaf headline from their editorial staff, or maybe it was from their actual editor. But I think one of the things that I like to think about when we talk about incorporating trauma awareness and peer support into our culture is that when you do that, you're inviting your staffers to help lead your newsroom and to contribute to the decision making. And I don't have firsthand experience with Philly or New York Times or these other instances that have happened, but I do think that when we bring people into the decision-making process, they feel like they have a say in what's going on and what the newsroom is covering and how it's covering it. And when an organization does that with its people, you have a much stronger connection with those people, and you don't have, theoretically at least, you don't have people in a situation where they feel like all the decisions are being made for them and they don't agree with those decisions, but they don't have a voice, and they can't participate in making those decisions. So I think that's one of the answers to why I do this. Kathy, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
No, I think that's exactly right. And one of the things that I read in between the lines in the Philadelphia Inquirer example was you got the sense that they did not have the space to share past critiques, to really band together and be listened and felt listened to by their managers, by the decision makers in that newsroom. And so that is definitely something that this can help make better.
And then there's the best practices aspect of this in terms of actually covering stories that happen in your community and that affect people on a deep level and that may be traumatic. We can learn more, and we can make different decisions or make trauma-informed decisions about our coverage that can really make a difference.
Scott, we have a question from Mary about how do we give voice when we are all remote? How can a manager really make it clear that you want to hear from them?
Schedule wall-to-wall Zoom meetings with your staff. I mean, that's a great question, because I know, and I'm sure that other people on the call feel this, but I have felt the frustration at not being able to, walk down the hall or walk around a corner or whatever and just talk to someone for 5 minutes. So, I mean, just one thing I would say, just from my experience, and it's me, but maybe it'll spark some ideas among other people here who may be able to contribute. But if you're if you're planning to cover, let's say, a protest, I think one of the issues that immediately you would be talking about would be the safety of your people who are going out to do it. So that could be a conversation among editors, or it could be a conversation among the whole staff. And that's a way for sort of everybody to take this issue and carry it along and come to some decisions about what to do. Similarly, if we've struggled in the WITF newsroom with the issue of who's organizing these rallies and who's behind them and who's showing up and who's agitating and all that, and so we've had discussions about how big a voice do we give, or how prominent do we cover somebody saying that Antifa is behind all of these protests and all they're out to do is break windows and assault people. This isn't maybe the most perfect example, but I guess what I'm getting at is draw your staff into issues of coverage decisions. Again, that's something that could be an editor's thing, and it really ultimately is the editor's call. But in this kind of reporters are thinking about this and they're concerned about it. So bring them into the decision making, and what are you seeing on the ground? What are you hearing? How do you think we should go about covering this? You know, what are the issues we need to deal with? The more voices, the better, I think. I don't know if that helps at all, but that's kind of what came to mind.
I would also add one-on-one, like because we're all remote, you know, doing just one-on-one time with the person that you think, you know, who has gone out and covered this, or you know is overworked, or you know is exhausted, checking in with them. And another way to phrase it is maybe not that we want to hear from you, but what do you need from us? You know, instead of feeling like they need to respond to your needs, like just offer yourself as like, what would you need from us? Like, do you need a day off? Do you need time? You know, or do you need to talk to me personally just to go over your experiences? Do you need a newsroom meeting to share what we've, you know, what learned? I think that phrasing it that way will put it back to them to feel like, you know, that we're here to help.
Right, and talk about anything, you know, whatever they want to bring up. So this whole idea of trauma awareness and peer support, and the things we're talking about now, like how do we work with staff and everything, there's a sort of a underlying feeling underneath it all where it's not like we're all jerks and we treat our people terribly, right? I mean, we're all compassionate people who care about our staffs, and so the point is here, I think, to figure out ways that we can intentionally build on that, on what we already do and what we already care about, and do things more intentionally, and again, incorporate it into our newsrooms and in our training. So are we getting more questions here, Kathy? Should we pause for a second? Or?
Nope, I was just responding to Mary. We're good.
So again, I've mentioned culture change a few times. I think, I mean, I've certainly encountered, but there's kind of a macho culture in journalism where you just go and you do the job, and you don't admit that you have any problem with it, and you know, you grit your teeth, or you go out and you have, you know, 5 beers that night, or whatever it is, and it's a sign of weakness to say to anyone, hey, I'm having trouble with what I covered today. And I think this effort, and I would say that it's a sign of strength. I mean, that's, I think, is the culture change that we need to get to, where we need to have newsrooms that are intentionally cultivating this idea that we are human, we can well be affected. Not everyone is going to be affected or has to be, but some people will be, and that's fine. And we need to be there to support them in different ways. So sign of strength. So it's also making ourselves better at what we do, and using peer support to help our colleagues who are coming back in from the field, having seen things that, for editors particularly, you know, we haven't seen those things. We get it secondhand from the reporters who are coming in, if we get it at all. But it's part of this peer support effort is about encouraging people, if they feel that it's right, to talk to their colleagues about what they've been, and to check up on their colleagues about what they've been through, but also putting ourselves as editors in a position of also doing the reaching out, kind of like what Kathy was just saying. You know, I think that's a fantastic question. You know, what can I do? What do you need from me or us? It's great. So things we can do, we can create best practices on these topics in our newsroom, and we can model them ourselves. I'm thinking there a little bit of self-care. You know, I think that part of the culture of journalism is that, hey, if it's a big story and it lasts for 60 days, I'll work 60 days because I don't want to not be part of the story. I want to be on the story. And and I think it's probably a good idea for people not to work 60 days in a row on a story. But if you're an editor, you probably shouldn't either. And so it's modeling the best practices as well as creating them. We can increase the resilience of our newsrooms. We can do effective, top-notch journalism while showing the care for the communities and the people that we're covering, that are going through these events. And again, we can recognize how coverage of specific stories, like the stories that are going on right now, can particularly affect journalists of color. And it's, people respond to difficult stories or traumatic stories in different ways, and sometimes it's based on their personal experience or the experience of a loved one, and that is certainly playing out now with journalists of color and protests against police brutality and systemic inequality, and it can happen in other ways as well. But in this particular moment, this is something that we can really bring to the forefront and think hard about. So trauma awareness, just quickly, would be, again, I think I just touched on this a few minutes ago, but learning more about what trauma does to survivors. I mean, this was a foundation of the training that I went through at DART, which is a cross-disciplinary training opportunity where they bring journalists together with clinicians, so that who are journalism advocates and who want to see journalism done well, but who understand that a journalist is not an arm of, a psychiatrist or a psychologist or whatever. They're independent, but they need to know more. So I think we can learn more about it, and that makes us better. When we learn about trauma, I think it affects, and I know, I've been through it many times, but it plays a role in how you make coverage decisions. And those decisions may be counter to what we would consider to be traditional journalism decisions. A couple of thoughts, and I'd be interested to hear anything from the group if you've encountered anything like this. But it's not recommended to cross-examine a trauma survivor as you would, for example, the mayor about the proposed budget that year, because of particularly what is happening inside the brain of someone who has survived a trauma. And so there are different ways to interview someone who is in that position that still allow you to do your job, which is to tell a true story and a resonant story without treating the person who has survived the trauma as though they are a subject that should be, cross-examined or held to the same account as, as a public official. And then there are other ways that plays into. We did I mentioned the school shooting that we had in New York, and the story that we did 9 years later. We eventually talked to enough people. It happened in a cafeteria before school, and we eventually talked to enough people that we could have published a graphic of literally where everyone was in the cafeteria that day, many by name. And we decided not to do that because it really was not germane to the story we were telling. It was just a thing that would allow people to say, ooh, that's what it looked like in there. And there may be a time and a place to do something like that, but we felt like doing that would essentially exploit the trauma that many of these kids had been through at that time, and we didn't want to go there. We wanted to tell a story about 2003, but we wanted to tell it from 2012, and we wanted to keep it in 2012 as much as we possibly could. So those are the kinds of decisions that I think about when we talk about this. I just mentioned a little bit about this. I mean, there are ways that we can do interviews and that we can do stories that tell a true and resonant story while respecting the people who are going through the experience. Sorry, flying through that a little bit, but that's sort of a quick look at some principles of trauma awareness. And then peer support draws on, you can draw on the resilient people in your newsroom. Many people have well-developed resilience skills, and they may not be affected by what they cover. And I always look at those people as those are the ones that I want in the effort because they can help other people. And in my experience, they often don't even realize that they're good at processing and at some of the key resilience factors. They just think, oh, that's the way I am. But they can be a real resource in your newsroom. a big thing for me and for the newsrooms I've been involved with is that you intentionally use your shared experience as a newsroom to strengthen the organization and the bonds with the staff. I think shared experience is a big deal and can be really used to a good advantage. Peer support is about checking in with staff or colleagues checking in with their colleagues, knowing what to watch for and how to do it, knowing how to have a structured conversation that can help someone who could benefit from that. That conversation can go like this, and this is a DART Center construct that I learned from Bruce and the people at DART, that you can sit down if you feel like a formal conversation would be helpful. You can ask someone. You can just say, hey, do you have a minute to talk about that story you just covered? And then you can just ask them these questions and sort of go through this structured conversation. Or this could be the conversation you lean on when someone comes to you and says, I'm really messed up over that event that I covered last week. Do you have a minute to talk? And then you can just say, tell me what happened to you. You don't have to tell me, but did it affect you? And how have you been since then? And what you're getting at there is if you kind of want to try to figure out if they're showing any of the symptoms of PTSD, like if they're not sleeping, if they're having intrusive thoughts, if they're hyper aware. Those are kind of the signals that something is going on. Those are all natural things to have happen, and they do happen with most people who've been through traumatic events or most journalists who cover things like that. And they should subside after about 2 weeks or 2 or 3 weeks. And if they don't, that's a signal that that person may be developing PTSD, and you want to take that a little more seriously and have another conversation with them and maybe move things along to a professional level. If they may want to move things on to a professional level at that point. And then at the end of the conversation, for again, the way that DART teaches peer support, and we'll talk about what it's not in a minute, but you just want to reinforce that they're human, their response is totally natural, there's nothing wrong with it. It's not that because they're a journalist, they're not supposed to feel this way. It's fine. You reassure them that they're not alone. And you can talk to them too about, you can amass some resources about self-care and resilience, which there's a resource page at the end of this, and I can probably dig up some more. I'm sure I can dig up some more and share with you if you're interested. And one thing too, we worked in New York with a psychologist, with a trauma psychologist who was part of who had been an EMT and was part of basically a peer support for first responders group. And she said one of the things that she always keeps in mind is that one of your roles when you talk to someone who's been through something like this is that you're not telling them what to do to process it or get over it, as much as you're reminding them that they already know, they already have the tools to process and to move through and to come out on the other side with, they'll be changed in some way by what they've covered, but they'll be okay, and they'll be able to move on. And most people have tools, and you're kind of there to remind them that you'll get there. You'll get there. And if you find yourself stuck or not getting there, then as a peer supporter in this conversation, you may say, well, you could consider, professional help. But one of the goals of establishing peer support and a culture of it in a newsroom is so that people don't end up feeling like they have to go to EAP or have to go to get professional help unless they really want to do that. It's to help them work through what they're dealing with the help of their peers and their colleagues.
I will say though, EAP is a great resource, and that you should not be hesitant to offer it. I have offered it to many reporters who, one, never thought to look into it. They like either knew about it, forgot about it, or they just never thought it could be for them, and have had such a great experience. because of it. And these are reporters who are dealing with anxiety, and not necessarily from trauma coverage, but just from the job itself,
Yeah.
And so I've had several reporters who just found it very helpful. And if you have it, like, definitely take advantage of it. It's free. Why not? You're already paying for it.
Yeah.
I'd also like to bring in Andrea, who just left a comment on a group chat, but our coordinating producer. Andrea, if you can talk a little more about that to the group, that would be great, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. And I think actually I'm looking at the next slide, and I don't know, Scott, if you want to go ahead and start. My comment kind of fits in about.
Just go for it. I'm reading your comment now. So.
Okay. Yeah. I actually got a fellowship from the DART Center a few years ago, and I spent 2 years in Kansas City covering gun violence and trauma. And just, yeah, so this discussion is really interesting to me, and I'm so glad that it's happening. I personally had a lot of secondary trauma that I didn't really register at the time and certainly didn't deal with. So it's nice to hear that this is kind of becoming a more mainstream common discussion at this time. But one thing that I just said in this comment is that I think I've seen a lot of advice circulating about not letting the story get to you, not letting things kind of get to you on an emotional level. And I think it's a really fine balance. Like, I think that we have a responsibility as reporters to our sources to hear and feel what they're experiencing and what they're going through. And I think when you do deeply listen, you feel, and it informs your coverage. And I certainly experienced that myself. I remember one interview I had with a mother whose son had been killed. I often shed a few tears in my interviews, and she looked at me and she was like, how do you deal with that? Like, because she knew I had been talking to so many people who had been going through this, and she was like, how do you go through this and cry every time? And, what's that been like for you? And it's a hard question to answer, but it did make me think more about the impact on me as a journalist. But it also always made me think more about, like, her experience, that woman's experience, her family's experience. So all of that's to say that I think we have a responsibility to maintain our humanity, and while also finding a way to take care of ourselves to preserve that. So.
Yeah, and I think
1,000%,
yeah, allowing that, not building a wall, I think also helps you process and understand what's going on. I think having to maintain a wall is a lot harder. If you think about all the humanity perspective, we're naturally nice people.
And to me, that's Andrea, thank you. And to me, that's a layer of that culture change, because I think the culture is. I'm an objective journalist. I'm just putting the microphone or putting the notepad in front of someone and taking down what they say, and then I'm going to go write the story, and off I go. And that story is not going to be as good unless you open yourself up, like you were saying, to what somebody's going through. And then once you do that, you're taking on part of the weight of what that person is going through. Obviously not in the same way, it couldn't possibly be in the same way, but you do take that weight on, and I think a lot of what we're talking about here is recognizing that you're doing that, and knowing that it's okay. Number one, it was okay to do that in the first place because you're trying to tell that true story. You're not trying to just get a quote and go away, right? And then number two, you recognize that, and it becomes something that then you will need to work through, and absorb, and colleagues can help. So yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. So a couple of things here about just this whole idea about, the idea of culture change and talking about this and making it okay to talk about it and productive. It's not a way to say, hey, everyone has to be affected if they go and cover a tough story. Or there's something wrong with you if you're not affected. That's not the point. Some people, like I said before, will be okay. Some won't, and it's about understanding that and responding to it, I think, as journalists. And nobody is saying that you have to talk if you are affected. We had a person in New York, when we were working on this in New York, 95% of the newsroom was totally into it and recognized why it was important and supportive. And there was one of our colleagues who sent me an email and said, and referred to this, quote, psychological program that we were putting in place, which, I said, okay, I mean, I get it, that's okay. But it's important, I think, to stress that, this isn't like a mandatory thing. In law enforcement, a lot of law enforcement and fire departments and EMTs and things, they'll have programs like this. They'll have, similar efforts. And in a lot of those cases, in my experience anyway, it is mandatory for them to talk. But for journalists, I think it's different. I don't know if anyone else has any other thoughts or experience with that, but I think for us, it's being open to the idea that it's okay to talk about it, and it can be productive. And then, so we're just saying that colleagues can help one another, like we just discussed. So here are some things that just are drawn from my experience, and take them for what they are, which is, like the slide said, tips and suggestions. You all know your newsrooms or news organizations better or best, and you know the people in them best, so you know what works and what has worked in other situations and what can work. But this is just drawn from some things that I've been involved with, and some advice from other people like Lisa Miller at the Australian Broadcasting Company, who worldwide, the ABC was one of the leaders in this many years ago. And Lisa is also a DART alum and has done a lot of training for briefs. And we were lucky enough to have her in our newsroom in New York to kick off our effort. And so she really stressed that it does not have to be, programmatic to the point of, setting up a Zoom call to sit down and talk about whatever. It can be very informal. It can be a text. It can just be a check-in. She calls it that mindset of being alert. So it's sort of being in that frame of mind. We try to find a lot of different ways to bring in the idea of peer support and trauma journalism into our newsroom, in an effort to make it consistent over time, so it didn't feel like a flavor of the month, or it didn't feel like, oh, we had a day of training on that and now we're on to something else. We wanted to give it a life in our newsroom. And so these are some examples of things we did. Again, you probably, people on this call probably have a million other ways that they could do it. But if you want to do something like this with trauma journalism and peer support, I would really strongly encourage figuring out different ways to bring it into the newsroom and make it a thing, make it a presence, and not something that, we sent 2 people out to get trained in this and, everyone else goes on about their day. One of the things we also did in New York was, we had those stretches that every newsroom has where you cover, 1 week, I think we covered a fatal car accident, a drowning, a high-profile criminal trial. There was like a perfect storm of things over a week or so. And so we brought the staff together and talked about how we did that, and what worked and what the challenges were, and we try to make it a learning experience. Some thoughts about that, if you had a big event and your entire staff wasn't involved, you could certainly ask the people who were prominent in that coverage, to lead the meeting and sort of raise the issues that they saw out there. And then and this is one thing that came out of our conversations with Ann and Kathy during the week. And again, Kathy, happy to have you jump in here. But in today's world, what we're doing right now, if we're bringing staff together to talk about particular challenges recovering the protests and COVID-19 to journalists of color, you can consider asking them in your newsroom to lead that discussion. And again, it's not you have to do this because we're going to have a meeting, but it's, do you want to? Would this be productive? Do you have some things that you'd like to say or discussion that you'd like to lead? I think is how I would approach it. Kathy, any other thoughts?
Yes, I think the idea here is to be as inclusive as possible. I did read something recently from a Black journalist who said, don't ask us to lead newsroom discussions about racial disparity, or don't ask us to teach you what's been wrong this entire time. And so I think you like this, if this is focused, it depends on how well your communication system is in your newsroom. And then approaching this as I think it's important that we share voices and that we love to learn from, what you've seen in our coverage. Just ask the newsroom what it is they need, what do they want to hear. I think that's the way, instead of approaching it with like, I have this thing in my head and I want you to do this, ask for it to come from the ground up. Like, what do they feel like the newsroom is needing right now to do the story, to either do stories better or to move forward from this? What are we missing? What should we be celebrating?
And can I just second that? I'm in another group of people who are in this editorial integrity and leadership fellowship thing. Tons of discussions that really came down to not specifically calling out your colleagues of color to lead the conversation or in any way calling them out in this time, but instead opening it up to everybody to have their feedback. I think there's a lot of frustration among people of color who get called on or get texts or whatever. How are you doing? How are you doing? By people in this situation. We're like, where were you 6 months ago? Where were you 5 years ago? So that was kind of where that came down.
Yeah, and if you address these issues in a consistent way, then everyone in your newsroom has a chance to have a voice, not just, oh, it affects you now, so let's bring you into it. Yeah, so there's different ways to approach that.
Mm-hmm. I think another way, just sorry, Scott, real quick, to build trust is being self-aware of where you are in your newsroom. Like, if you know that this isn't something you've done before and where you're not good at, just kind of start to open it with that. And we haven't been really great about, talking about systemic racism or in our, taking care of our folks after covering trauma and we want to do better. So help us, have that, be honest with yourselves, be self-aware. And I think that actually will invite dialogue.
Yeah. And one of the interesting things too about this idea of staff meetings to talk about what you've done is, particularly in a case where there were a lot of staffers covering something, not everyone is always aware of what everyone else on the staff did or may have done, including the people who weren't in the field but were in the office doing any of the number of tasks that have to be done when there's major breaking news. And when you get people together like that and you just go around and say, hey, what did you do during that coverage? And people start to hear, and someone who was in the field hears that someone who was in the office was doing A through E, to get this stuff online or to get research done or whatever. And it gives people a togetherness that they otherwise might not have, about feeling like they're part of a team and part of a group effort. And it can help make people feel less isolated if they were feeling isolated about what their particular job was. Just in closing, and I apologize for coming so close to 2 o'clock, and I hope there maybe are some questions that we can fit in. But when we did a training in I think around 2015 with about 22 people from 6 or 8 different newsrooms in our region, we asked them, and Bruce from the Dart Center was the leader of that training, and we asked them at the end, to tell us what they thought, and these are the answers, and these are things I think we would want any of our staffers to feel, after such a training and with the prospect of this kind of effort. And this was a specific comment by a journalist there, which he just really gets at the climate change aspect of it, and the idea of talking about it versus not talking about it. acting intentionally versus just kind of going on as we are, thinking that everything will be okay. I believe we have a resources page, so we'll share this obviously later. And then if you have any questions or want the presentation, there we are. So thanks so much, everyone, for listening and for your contributions. And I'd love to hear any questions or just any other thoughts, anything that's come to mind while we've been going through this from your own individual experiences, because all of that can just feed into this and help us, figure stuff out and get better.
No? Okay. Well, if not, then we can actually finish a few minutes early. Thank you so much, Scott. This was super helpful,
You're welcome.
and
Thank you.
I'm so glad we were able to do this. And again, just get in touch with either of us if you would like more information, or if you would think this would be helpful to any other newsrooms that you work with. Have a great day.
See you guys.
Bye.